Good afternoon. I know you don't all yet have copies of the text, but more are being printed upstairs and will be brought down. I am so deeply honored to introduce our teacher this Yom Kippur afternoon, though many of you, and I've heard the conversations, know him quite well. Rabbi Dr. Lawrence A. Hoffman is Professor Emeritus of Liturgy, Worship, and Ritual at the Hebrew Union College in New York, the co-founder of Synagogue 2000, a project to transform synagogues into moral and spiritual centers for the 21st century, the author and editor of 50 books, and the recipient of 2 National Jewish Book Awards. More than that, to me, he has been a beloved mentor and friend since my arrival at HUC 30 years ago. I have never stopped turning to him for wisdom. No one possesses a greater awareness of the richness of our ancient tradition, the complexity of contemporary Jewish life, and how the one can inform the other. Today, he will address the central prayer of these holy days, the Unatana Tokef, the title of his talk being, Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die? Really? Please welcome Rabbi Larry Hoffman.
My thanks to Rabbi Davidson for that lovely introduction. I come just to be introduced. And he introduces me always so well, I keep coming back. I actually have a very fond memories of working here a few years back, and this is my home away from home. If I were in New York, you would see me every day here. I come when I can. It's a remarkable institution. There's nothing like Temple Emanu-El in the entire country. For that matter, beyond the country, it's an institution of significance whose fingerprints are on change around the country and has the impact and greater impact, I think, than over the years than any other synagogue. It's an honor to be here. I'm proud to be here, and I thank you for inviting me very much. It's good to see people here whom I already know. I've had a chance to meet 3 or 4 people who I've met on occasion. Others I think probably I know as well, and I hope in the future I'll greet you and say, oh, I remember you from this time. Having met you now, you'll be someone that I know. We're going to talk about an important prayer today, but more than that, we're going to talk about what's the point of prayer anyway. Because the real problem with prayer is that most times we don't always agree with what the prayers say. Just out of curiosity, how many people here find themselves sometimes praying things that they say, I don't know about that? I mean, is it not just me, right? I mean, is there anyone here who can say they agree with the whole prayer book? I mean, mostly we take a look at it and we assume it, well, we don't agree with it, but we read it because that's what you do. But if you take it seriously, how do you handle prayers that you don't agree with? And come to think of it, what's the point of it all? So those are some of the kind of large questions that we're going to answer today, a little bit anyway. But we're going to do it by looking at one particular prayer, and that is called the Unatana Tokef. And you'll recognize parts of it. The translation varies depending upon what prayer book you use. Union Prayer Book had a small version of it. The prayer book that you have now has a somewhat larger version of it. And I have here the original, which is larger still. So you won't recognize it all, but you'll recognize some of it. Do you remember the part about who shall live and who shall die? How many people remember at least that part? Oh yeah, sure, that sticks with you, right? And how many people remember repentance, prayer, and charity? Being good things, right? All right, so you'll remember part of the prayer, but as we go along, you'll see it's much larger than you think. And that's going to take us to the story of its origin. And the story is better than the prayer itself. So we're going to look at this prayer, then look at the story of its origin, and that's going to return us to the question about what do you do when you don't agree with what the prayers actually say? Okay? So, I'll read it because it's simpler that way. If we had a smaller room, I'd invite somebody to do so, but you'll have to pardon me if I do all the reading. So here it is. Let us acknowledge the power of this day's holiness, for it is full of awe and dread. I'm going to stop on occasion and ask you how you're doing. Do you think this is okay? Keep in mind, you like it or you don't. All right? It's full of awe and dread. On it your kingdom will be exalted and your throne will be established in love, and you will reign from it in truth. Truly you are judge, prosecutor, litigant, and witness, writer of the verdict and its sealer, recorder and recounter. Now, stop there. How many people are lawyers in the crowd here today? Even a little legal training? What do you think of this trial? I mean, God is everything, right? It's what we tend to call in American English a kangaroo court. I think in Australia they have a different word for it, maybe a squirrel court, I don't know. But you get the idea. This is a court that you wouldn't want to be caught in. So God is everything. But note, everybody's on trial here. Today is the day of trial. Picture, it's a theater. And picture the backdrop. Oh, it's a day of trial. And everybody's frightened. Because, oh my God. In fact, God, you remember everything that's been forgotten. You open the book of memories. It will be read. Everyone's signature is in it. Now, that's the literal translation. What it probably means is something like their fingerprints are all over it, you know? Or maybe, guess what? Here's your signed confession. So God is everything. Nobody gets to talk. Nobody gets to do anything. You say, what's the point of the trial? It's a foregone conclusion. It looks that way. No wonder then, look this, a great shofar will be sounded, and a thin whisper of sound will be heard. That's brilliant, actually. Think of the large shofar that Rabbi Davidson has. You know, at the end of Neilah, he'll blow this long shofar, and you know the sound that comes out? But here what we're told is, you'll get a thin whisper of sound. That's taken from the story of Elijah. Usually the Hebrews translated as a still, small voice. Elijah is escaping an evil king and queen who are about to kill him because he's been zealous for God. And he's running away. And he knows he feels abandoned. And here he is all alone, and he waits to hear from God. And so what do we get? We get thunder, lightning, and God is none of those things. God appears in a thin whisper of sound. Now, think of that. This is this great trial of the entire world. And it begins with the blowing of the shofar. And out comes a still small voice, a thin whisper of sound. And that's how you know that God is the judge. So here is God in this silence. Angels recoil, their grip is shaking and trembling. This is the day in court, they will say, for passing judgment on the hosts on high. Everyone's going to be tried, not just human beings, everyone, even the angels. They will not pass muster as innocent when you judge them. All who enter the world must pass before you like sheep. An alternative translation is like soldiers on review. Have you seen the movies? You know where the colonel, something like that, and they pass muster. So we are now to be judged by God, who is our shepherd or who is our colonel, general, something like that. And everyone is going to be tried. Please note, this is not just Jews. Look, it's all who come into the world. If time allows, I'll try to get to that at the end. This is a day for the human race. For every single being, all that has life, is to be tried according to this poem. As the shepherd searches for his flock and has his sheep pass under his staff, so too will he record and recount and review all living beings as you have them pass by, and you will decide the end of all creatures, writing down their sentence. And here's the famous part. On Rosh Hashanah it will be written, and on Yom Kippur it will be sealed. How many will pass on, and how many will be created? Who will live and who will die? Who at their proper end and who not? who by water, who by fire, who by warfare, who by wildlife, who by hunger, who by thirst, who by earthquake, who by plague, who by strangling, who by stoning, who will rest and who will wander, who will be tranquil and who will be troubled, who will be calm and who will be tormented, who will be exalted and who will be humbled, who will be rich and who will be poor. That's all decided today. And that's where I think you'll agree the poem gets difficult. Now we can look at it as a metaphor, and we will. That's what you have to do. In fact, the first answer to the question of how do you deal with prayers that are difficult, you don't take them literally. You treat them as a metaphor. So far, so good. So it's a metaphor, fine. But that's not what it says. The poet doesn't say, I don't mean this really. And the problem with prayer is you think that you should mean it really. And so you say to yourself, is everything predetermined? What about, God forbid, that so-and-so who took sick this year? Was that determined last Yom Kippur? People who died in COVID? You mean the Yom Kippur before it was determined they would die of COVID? Which is one of the things in here, no doubt, who by plague, right? And so you stop and you say, this can't be. And as it happens, the prayer was so difficult for modern Jews that the early Union prayer book just omitted it. Who needs it? It was so famous, though, it came back into our machzor, so we have it now in our prayers. And now we wonder what to do with it. Fortunately, the next line we do like. Repentance, prayer, and charity help the hardship of the decree pass. Now, that translation at the end allows for different interpretation. Does that mean if you have repentance, prayer, and charity, we will annul the decree? No. But it does mean you'll find it easier to deal with. Is that true? And so you're left at least wondering, what's the message of the prayer? If it were simple prose, if it were simple nonfiction, then you say, okay, I see what it says, I agree or disagree. But since it's your prayers, you want to agree. And it doesn't always seem that this is the way the world works. Well, but now we change to the next paragraph. Look, now we're talking about God. We've been talking about ourselves. We are sinners. Kangaroo court. We walked into the case with having signed a confession. God is all powerful, and we don't even get our own attorney to defend us. Well, maybe we repent today and we pray and we'll give some charity, which I'm in favor of all three, by the way, don't get me wrong. But is it really going to help if something terrible happens and we know that it was foreordained today? That's our situation. But now we get to God. Your glory is like your name, slow to anger, quick to forgive. And you say, wait a minute, is that what they said above? You do not want the dead to die, but for them to return from their paths and live. You wait until the day they die, accepting them immediately if they return. Well, maybe repentance will help us after all. Truly, you are their creator and you know their nature. And now we get this brilliant line that was in the Union Prayer Book as well. Who are we? They, in the third person. They are flesh and blood. Their origin is dust and their end is dust. At great peril they gather food. They are like shattered pottery, like withered grass, like a faded blossom, like a passing shadow, like a vanishing cloud, like blowing wind, like blowing dust, like a dream that will fly away. That part was in the Union Prayer Book. That seems to be the story of our lives. Take it or leave it, it's true. Now we're back on what looks like true. And now we say, but wait a minute, what about God? By contrast, but you are king, the living everlasting God. Your years are boundless and the length of your days endless. Your glorious chariots are priceless, and the eternity of your name is limitless. So we are this limited creature, and God, by contrast, is eternal. Your name suits you, and you suit your name. You have bestowed your name on us. Then we say, act for the sake of your name, sanctify your name, and so on and so forth. And you'll see at the top of page 2, it ends with, holy, holy, holy. So let me just point out the context of this poem. Have you ever been in a traditional service on Yom Kippur? How many people have been in a traditional shul, maybe on Yom Kippur, or even a conservative shul for that matter? Have you ever counted the pages? I mean, you go to a traditional shul. I was raised in one. We spent all day. The machzor was this thick. And even if you know how to read Hebrew, you get to some pages where you can't make sense of anything in the page. And you just wonder, how many pages do I still have left to go? And you walk in and you say, well, they're probably around page 150 or 180, maybe 200. What's the difference? It's 600 pages. And they go through it rapidly. Now, the reason for that is that throughout all of Jewish history, we had great poets who wrote poetry that they inserted into the standard prayers. The most famous prayer of all, the most important prayer for the rabbis, was the prayer we called the Amidah, where you stand and you sort of stand before God. And part of that is this holy, 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 kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. More beautiful music has been written for that than any other prayer. That's the centerpiece of our prayer. Indeed, originally when Jews prayed, their model was the angels. They believed in angels on high. And the angels surrounded the throne of glory saying, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And their idea of us was, if we really focus on the prayer, maybe we can rise as well and feel as if we are in this atmosphere of God and the angels. And we're saying Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh too. The result was that the most important poems that were inserted into the machzor was poems around the Amidah, particularly at that time when we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That was outfitted with gorgeous poetry, and eventually cantors took great music, and that's where the great music was found as well. Our poem doesn't look like a poem, but it is. It's a poem of a different style than we're used to. We'll come back to that. Our poem was a poem that was inserted just before Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. The high point of the liturgy got the greatest poem inserted into it. Now, we need to know the name of this poem. The poem that we have here is actually the 9th part of a larger poem. And this was commonplace throughout Jewish history, to write 9-part poetry that got fitted into the first 3 blessings of the Amidah. So that the 9th part was just before you say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We're looking at the 9th part of what was once a much longer poem, and the earlier parts have gotten lost. All we have now is this 9th part that stayed. These large poems were called a karovah, a Hebrew word that means an offering. And the idea was, we can no longer offer sacrifices to God, but we can offer prayers, the most beautiful poetry we can offer. So these poems were called offerings, as it were, but offerings of our lips, offerings of our artistry. The 9th part is known as a siluk. That word's going to come up later. Siluk, siluk. Siluk was just the name of the 9th part. This is a siluk. And siluk comes from a Hebrew Aramaic word meaning to go up. So imagine someone, now figure the metaphor, you're offering a sacrifice, and then the sacrifice goes up to God. Follow the metaphor through. The 9th part then was the part where the poem, as it were, rises up to God and to the angels up there saying Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. This is then the rising up part, the part where the offering finally is received in heaven. Now, we want to find out how this thing got written. And so here we get to a legend. I remember it well because my rabbi told me the story when I was young. I went to an Orthodox shul in town. It was the only game in town. Small Canadian town. My parents were not Orthodox. They were probably conservative, I guess, though they didn't know that. We were all just Jews, and we all went to the only synagogue that there was. The rabbi, however, was Orthodox, and we were all in synagogue when we got to this prayer, and he interrupted the service to tell us the story. Now, I have to give you a trigger warning, because the story has some torture in it. But he would tell us in stentorian voice about Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, who was tortured for his faith. So I knew the story even before I found it in Jewish sources. Eventually I found it, and I've translated it for you. I'm going to read it to you. But picture now my rabbi summarizing the story. I'm 10 years old, and he's telling me about this man who was tortured to death because of anti-Semitism. Well, more complex than that, as you will see. I'm no longer 10, and I'm no longer quite as frightened, but it's some story to tell a 10-year-old. Here we go. This is the story of how the prayer got started. It's a legend about, I call it legend, you'll see why in a moment, about a Rabbi Amnon. He was a Rabbi Amnon who lived in Mainz. Now you'll see in page 2, the legend is from a book called Sefer Or Zerua by a Rabbi Isaac of Vienna, who tells us the story was attributed to Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn. I noticed, by the way, an aside, nowadays almost all synagogues sound the same. So I say, oh, where you're the rabbi, I say to a student of mine who I have lost track of, and he says something like, oh, Beth Sholem. There are 50,000 Beth Sholems. Even Emanu-El, there's more than one Emanu-El. We have sort of a limited number of names for synagogues. Well, it seems to me that in the Middle Ages, they had a minimum number of names for rabbis. Because after a while, they all sound exactly the same, which is my way of saying, don't bother memorizing these two people. We'll come back to them. The only name you need is Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. Here's the story. Story of Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. Great in his generation, wealthy, a fine lineage, handsome and good-looking. The nobles and the bishop began to ask him to apostatize to their mistaken way, and he refused to listen to them. You see, this is set in about the 12th century or so. It's a period, of course, in Western Europe, Christianity is supreme, and the bishop is in charge of the entire territory. Amnon lives under the bishop, and you can see that he's now he's a very good guy, but nobles and the bishop in the feudal system are asking him to apostatize, but he won't listen. So it happened that while they were talking to him one day and he was refusing to listen, the noble badgered him until he replied, I want to think the matter through for 3 days. He said this just to put them off. But the minute he took leave of the noble, what he had said sunk in, how an expression of doubt had left his lips, as if there were any possibility that any sort of advice or thought process would lead him to deny the living God. He went home, unable to eat or drink. His relatives and friends came to console him, but he refused consolation, saying, because of what I said, I will go to my grave in grief. On the 3rd day, still pained and anxious, the noble sent for him, and he replied, I won't go. When the evil one sent princes more numerous and honored than at first, he still refused to go. I mean, he keeps sending more and more people of higher stature to convince him to come, and he won't come. So the noble ordered that Amnon be quickly brought against his will, and they speedily brought him. He asked, what's this, Amnon? Why didn't you come to me as you stipulated? Having thought it over, why didn't you return word to me as I expected you to? Amnon replied, let me adjudicate my own case. The tongue that lied to you deserves to be cut off. Amnon wanted to sanctify the name of God because he had spoken as he did. No, the bishop responded, not your tongue will I cut off, it spoke well, but your feet that did not come when you promised, and I will torture the rest of your body. Here comes the part that the rabbi dwelled on. Thus did the evil one command, and they hacked off his fingers and toes bit by bit. At each joint they would ask him, Amnon, now do you want to convert to our faith? And he would say, no. When they finished hacking, the evil one commanded that Rabbi Amnon be laid on a shield with the pieces of his extremities beside him and be sent home. And that is why his name is Amnon, because Amin, he had faith in the living God and suffered horrendous torture out of love just on account of something he had said. Can you hear the sound similar between Amnon and Amin? They come from the same Hebrew root. So the author says his name was Amnon because he had faith. This is a story of Rabbi Faithful. Sometime later, the time rolled around for Rosh Hashanah to arrive, and he asked his relatives to take him to the synagogue, along with all the fingers and toe joints which had been salted, and to lay him next to the prayer leader. They did so, and when the prayer leader got to the Kedusha, are you with me? I skipped the brackets. Rabbi Amnon said, wait a minute, while I sanctify the name of God. In a loud voice he then responded, therefore let holiness rise up to you, as if to say, I have sanctified your name with regard to your sovereignty and your unity. Then he recited Unatana Tokef Kedushat Hayom. That's our poem. Truly, you are judge and prosecutor in order to accept the verdict of his fingers and toes being removed, and so on and so on. And then he mentioned everyone's signature is in it, since that was the fate determined for him on Rosh Hashanah. When he had completed the Siluk, that's the name of the poem, remember, he was taken up, Nistalek. Can you hear this, the play on words? Siluk goes up. He was Nistalek, Siluk, Salak. He went up like Elijah of old. He didn't even die. He just went straight up to God in the sight of all present. He disappeared from the world and was no more. Of him it is said, how much goodness you have stored up for those who love you. Because of the truthful words that Amnon had offered up, he was invited into the yeshiva on high. That's a euphemism for heaven. Because what do rabbis do in heaven? They go to yeshiva. They study more Talmud. On the third day after he was ritually washed and purified, he appeared in a night vision to our Rabbi Kalonymus, son of Rabbi Meshulam, son of Rabbi Kalonymus, son of Rabbi Moshe, son of Rabbi Kalonymus, and taught him that very poem, Unatana Tokef, and bade him distribute it throughout the far reaches of the exile, that it might be witness and memorial to him. And the Gaon, that means the rabbi, and the rabbi did so. So what do you think of the story? I mean, it's gruesome, right? According to the story, this poem gets written by Rabbi Amnon, who passes it along, who on his deathbed he says it, right? And after he dies, he appears in a night vision to Rabbi Kalonymus. There's not a lot of Rabbi Kalonymuses in New York. But Rabbi Kalonymus is the name of the Kalonymite family that founded German Jewry. Mainz on Rhineland had been founded by a family of the Kalonymites. They had settled Italian Jewry, and then in the 10th century, they had crossed the Alps and settled Germany in the Rhineland. So he appears not just to any old Rabbi Schwartz, Rabbi Hoffman, Rabbi Davidson. No, he appears to a Rabbi Kalonymus, who is obviously from the family of rabbis, and therefore this will be part of German Jewish tradition ever after, which in fact it is. Not one word of this is true. There was no Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. The entire thing is a story made up to explain the context of the Middle Ages and attached to a poem. If we believe the story, then it turns out that the greatest poetic creativity of the Jewish people occurs when Jews are persecuted. Had he not been persecuted, we'd have no Unatan Tokef. And that is what I was taught, and that is what many Jews believe, that our history until modern times was so filled with persecution, anything creative we did must have been in response to persecution. Except the story's false. It never happened. Now, the story is cleverly written, I'll tell you that. Do you think it's a coincidence that his name was Rabbi Amnon because Amin, he had faithful? Of course not. The person who wrote it was writing it as a morality tale. He could have called him anything. He decided to call him Rabbi Faithful because that's the whole point of the story. And then he wanted to Nistaleh, to go up. And that was perfect because he had him write a Siluk. So now the poem suggests his future, what's going to happen to him. And he's famous. He's like Elijah. He doesn't even bother dying. He just goes directly to God. Cut out the middleman. There are other things in the story, too, that are really clever. For example, remember that he was good looking? You might have noted that at the beginning, right? I've been introduced many, many times. No rabbi has ever said Rabbi Hoffman is a very fine scholar and teacher. Also, he's good looking and handsome. I mean, wait a minute. No one ever says that. Even if I were, they wouldn't say it. That's not acceptable. You think then he really was good looking and handsome? No. That's a quotation out of the Bible about Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph? Joseph is sold into slavery, right? Egypt, remember that stuff? And then what happens to him afterward? Where does he go afterwards? Remember that? He goes to work for a merchant named Potiphar. Potiphar's busy merchanting, and meanwhile, Mrs. Potiphar is at home. And Mrs. Potiphar kind of likes Joseph, who is good looking and handsome. And she tries to seduce him. And Joseph will have none of it. The rabbis tell endless stories about how wonderful Joseph was. At one point, she takes a pitchfork and sticks it under his neck, because he won't look at her. And she looks in his face because she's so beautiful, and now he has to look at her. But he still won't be seduced, because he calls up the image of his deceased father and watches his father saying, no, 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 no. I mean, this guy has great willpower. So he is known in Jewish tradition as the one who would never give in to seduction. And that's what Rabbi Amnon is, isn't he? He won't give in to the seduction of converting to the bishop's way of life, to Christianity. So the story is filled with hints. You should know at the very beginning, wait a minute, they're talking about Rabbi Joseph here. Aha! You tell the story right away. You can imagine this story being told and told and told, but it was not true, and I'm not sure anyone ever believed it was true. But it was meant as a morality tale. So if the poem wasn't written by a Rabbi Amnon, when was it written? And why was the story told in the 12th century? Now, I've given you some names of people. You can look at the final page under characters and context. So you can see in the characters, there are two people we're going to talk about briefly called Yanai, who was a synagogue poet. You see that? 5th century. And a man named Romanos, who was a 5th century church poet about the same time. And we were already introduced to Ephraim of Bon, who told the story, and Isaac or Zeruah, who related it in Rabbi Ephraim of Bon's name. The backdrop was the Crusades. In 1095, the First Crusade swept across Europe, And the first Crusaders stopped off in Germany, and I liken them to kids in the back of a car when you're on a long trip. Look, they were on their way to the Holy Land to rid the Holy Land of Muslims. They didn't know how far Israel was. They were going to go through Constantinople. Where's Constantinople? They had no maps. Never mind no GPS. And they were walking. So they walk and they get as far as the Rhineland and they stop and they reconnoiter and they say, "Are we there yet?" And the answer is no, but don't worry, you can kill some people here. So they massacred Jews in what was the equivalent in their time of our Shoah. I mean, it was terrible. And they tortured them. There are stories about parents who killed their own children rather than let them fall into the hands of the Crusaders. This left its impact, just the way the Shoah left its impact on us. By 1099, the Crusaders got as far as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and they set up a Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasts almost 100 years. By the middle of the next century, there is a Muslim counteroffensive, and a second crusade is proclaimed. And once again, they pass through the Rhineland and they kill Jews. Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn followed all of this, and in 1177, he wrote a book of memory to memorialize the people who had been killed. And he says the slaughter was so great that the day after, the bishop ordered the remains of all the slaughtered saints to be loaded onto wagons, along with their severed limbs, etc., so they could be buried. So that's in the back of his mind, and that informs his story. Near the end of the century, 10 years after he writes the story in the book of memory, Saladin, remember Saladin the Great? He destroys the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. And then Isaac ben Moses of Vienna writes Or Zarua. He writes the book that attributes the story of Rabbi Amnon of Mainz to Ephraim of Bonn. What's going on here is that the rabbi lives in this terrible, terrible period. Jews were being persecuted then. And he wants to make sense of it. And he knows that Jews have died for no good reason. And he wants them not to convert to Christianity, and he's afraid that there's going to be a third massacre when that third crusade breaks out, because he heard already that a crusade was in the works. And so he writes a model story about Rabbi Faithful, and he says, look, you're going to be persecuted, I know, and some of you will die, but if you die, you will die for God. You will die for a good purpose, and you, like Rabbi Amnon, can be faithful. He wants to hold out to people the sense that their deaths are not without purpose, that somehow they died for a greater cause. And he wants them to know that there is life after death. There is some kind of life eternal. Now go back to the poem. He did not write this poem. The poem is much older. The poem goes back to that first person on your list, Rabbi Yannai, the great poet of the 4th and 5th century. We're going to get there in a minute. He finds this poem. And he notes that the poem isn't all bad. I passed over it too quickly. Look at this great line at the end. I am on page 1. Second to last paragraph starting, but you are king. Remember how we are just flesh and blood, we are shadows passing in the night, dust to dust and so on? But you are king, the living everlasting God. It's all right, we're not like God. Your years are boundless and so on. The eternity of your name is limitless. Now, when they spoke about a name, they had a sense that a name gave you or could give you the essence of a person. And so they say, your name, God, suits you. You suit your name. Now, what is God's essence? God's essence is living, everlasting. Your years are boundless. The length of your days, endless. Whatever God is. And the poet doesn't presume to know everything about God. But by definition, God is eternal. And therefore, God's name is eternal. And therefore, here's this one-liner. You have bestowed your name on us. The poet is telling us poetically that we have God in us, that we are divine. There is something divine about us. Call it your soul, call it what you will. That there is some way in which we participate in eternity. That this life is not all there is. There is something grander, greater. And Judaism has had many ways of describing it. But that there is something more. I call it a moreness, M-R-E-N-E-S-S. There's a moreness to life, is what the poet promises in the end. So penitence, prayer, and charity help us. But no matter what happens, we are part of God. And we pass on to be somehow part of eternity. What happens then is in this terrible time, the rabbi who is living through the Crusades, Ephraim of Bonn, finds this poem. He attaches a story to it to give hope to the people who have been killed or who will be killed, and to tell them that their life is not in vain and that they will be part of eternity. And his story reminds them that they are like Amnon. They should not give in. They should be faithful as well. So much then for the story in the Middle Ages. But wait, where did the poem come from? Not from the Middle Ages. The poem, he found it. It was there already. For years, we had no idea who wrote it until eventually, some years back, we discovered a manuscript of it at the Hebrew University. In its vast treasure trove of manuscripts have come from all over the world. They're all there at that great university of ours. And someone found the poem, the original poem. And it was by, as I told you a moment ago, Yanai, page 3. 4th and 5th century. Now, the 4th and 5th century, we weren't being persecuted. This is called the Byzantine era. The Western Empire of the Roman Empire had been destroyed. Mostly, the Roman Empire was being ruled out of Constantinople. By the 4th century, the Christian church had taken over the empire and were building wonderful churches. You've seen them with mosaics. Have you seen those great mosaic churches? The poets of the church began writing liturgy for these great churches. But we had synagogues, and we had poets doing the same. Here was a period where the creative poets who were Christian and Jewish knew each other and were doing the same sort of thing. So the Christian poet Romanos, it turns out, wrote a poem that's almost the same as this one. And we have a copy of that too. Romanos, though, was a Christian. For him, this final trial that frightens even the heavenly hosts, for Romanos, that takes place at the end of time. It is the final judgment when Christ comes a second time. And there's no penitence, prayer, and charity in there. This is the end of time, folks. Nothing you can do. Our poet, however, takes the same themes and says, well, it's not the end of time. It's just every Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And he puts penitence, prayer, and charity in. Well, the first lesson to be learned is that Jewish creativity does not come when we are persecuted. It comes when we have money, education, time, and will to develop Jewish culture, which is my message for us in America this day. Never has there been a Jewish community with greater means and greater opportunity and greater education than now. What we can create is endless. And I know this synagogue is well on its way to contributing, as it has all along, and still has much to do, to contributing to what American Jewish life will hold. We will create the way Yanai created in the 4th and 5th century. But now I'm back to my first question. What do you do when you don't believe it? So first you say, well, it's metaphor. and I accept that. Secondly, you read it carefully like a poem. You say, wait a second, it's not so bad. See this? God's name is like our name, and God puts his name on us, and so look at us. We are part of the divine, and makes you think for the rest of the day, perhaps, is there eternity? How might I be part of eternity? And when I die, and those who have died will remember in the memorial service, Judaism's promise is that they are somehow part of eternity. What could that mean? So even in a poem where much of it we don't like, we can find things we do like. And we can say even, but that's life, isn't it? You never know what life will bring. I accept that. But I want to go farther at the end. The last 10 or 15 minutes, I want to expand what one does. It's called, I call it, if you like, a reading strategy or a prayer strategy to get the most out of services. How many people have gone to the opera? How many of you who went to the opera went because of the story? Couple hands. You are brave. Mostly, the stories are stupid. I mean, I'm not talking about the really, some of the operas are not, but sometimes you read, I'll tell you about the story of the opera. See, there's this woman and she has a fairy godmother, but the fairy godmother fell in love with actually her actual father, and then they decided they would have a child, but they couldn't have a child, so they had me. And then because of that, I found myself in a bog one day and a toad turned into a prince. I mean, this is not crazy in the world of opera. But you know something? When I go there to the opera, which I like a lot, even though I don't believe the story, I fall in love with it. And at the end, I cry. And I find myself crying as the beauty of the music and the setting and the acting, this complete, marvelous work of art, carries me away. Think of reading a novel. Why do you read novels? Someone would say to you, but it's not true. But novels can give you truths that a nonfiction can't give you. And so you insist, oh, you got to read this book. It's so beautiful. At the end, I got to read you this passage from it. Art has a way of informing our consciousness and helping us encounter lessons that regular nonfiction can't give us. Now, literature has a phrase for this. When you read great literature, you must suspend your disbelief. If you start reading the book and you say, it's fiction, I don't believe it already, then of course you can't fall in love with the story. You say, it's just a story. These people never really lived. But when you read a great novel, for that moment you are drawn in, and this is your world. Art works that way. Art invites you in, but you have to identify with it, suspend your disbelief, and say, for the next 2 hours, 5 hours a day, I am part of this story. And you fall in love with the story, and at the end you cry, or you laugh, or you rejoice, depending on what the story helps you do. Worship, our prayers, are that kind of experience. Walk into the synagogue, look at the grandeur of Emanu-El, helps you do it. And for those moments, those hours, this is your story. This is the reality. Yes, the prayer book, you may not believe it literally, but believe it the way you would a novel. As grand poetry, a grand story, with the music that comes along with it, hence most like an opera. Think of worship as the grand drama of the Jewish people through time, which has been added to all along so that it's not just written once and done, but it keeps collecting new things. New prayer books have new experiences. What you're entering into, if you like, is a spiritual tell. You know those mountains where civilization has layers and the archaeologist plumbs to the bottom? So that's what a prayer book is like. Layers and layers of Jewish experience, of human experience. And you lose yourself in the readings and in the music and in the raising of the Torah and all the Torah stands for. It is grand drama, hence the genius, actually, of Emanu-El. I want to leave you then with some sense of the drama of the high holidays. Literature works with symbolism. Our prayers are filled with it. We saw some of the things here, like an allusion to Joseph and so on. But the symbols frequently refer not to some story in the Bible, to our own lives. So think of the following. Start with me at Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is famously known for the shofar. According to the Talmud, when the shofar is blown, the sounds of the shofar, yes, the Talmud says this is the sound of giving birth. This is the sound of a woman in labor. Because the grand theme of Rosh Hashanah, says the Talmud, is the birth date of the world. The whole point of Rosh Hashanah is that the world is to be recreated today. If you like, Rosh Hashanah is like Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. It's just the most famous one. It is therefore, in a way, a woman's holiday, and in fact, all the symbolism is of a woman, and God is, in fact, imagined as female, birthing the world. The point is that Rosh Hashanah is a recollection of birth, and you won't be surprised, therefore, to find that Yom Kippur is a recollection of death. Now, with birth, remember the shofar ends with the grand Tekiah Gedolah, right? And according to the rabbis, this is when the actual birth of the world occurs. And when we too, as it were, it's poetry. We too, as it were, can discover a renewed birth of ourselves. So the promise of Rosh Hashanah is a new world can be born. You can be born into it. You can have a new life. And now you get 10 days. And now you will practice your death. Traditionally, Yom Kippur is about death. Traditionally, Jews wore a kittel, a white garment that was equivalent to the shrouds in which you would be buried. Later, that was changed to a talit. Normally, the talit is worn in the morning, but traditionally, Jews wore the talit all day on Yom Kippur as if they were going to get buried, as if they are dead. They treated their bodies as if they were dead. You fast, you don't eat, you don't drink, no sex. You're not allowed even traditionally to wash yourself. It's as if your body doesn't exist for that day. Before the dinner the night before, like last night, people would go to the cemetery and visit their deceased ancestors. And they actually asked them, traditionally, to intercede for them in the world to come, as if those righteous people who preceded us in death are up there in heaven, as it were. And maybe on Yom Kippur they'll argue for us because this is the day of judgment. And what if we sin too much? I mean, just maybe. What if we did? They'll argue for us. Parents would bless their children, but they had a special blessing. And the blessing that they used was a blessing as if to say, I might not make it through the next day. This might be the last blessing you have. And then, as I say, they fast, they treat their body as nothing. And they confess all day, which, by the way, is what you do in your deathbed. You confess. And so the whole day is practice, as it were, for death. And it starts with Kol Nidre. So there's an ark, the picture of the Great One in the sanctuary. The ark in Hebrew is called Aron Kodesh, holy ark. You're not allowed to say Aron, ark, without Kodesh, holy. They're all one word. We call it the ark, but traditionally you say holy ark always. Because look what happens on Yom Kippur. You take the Torah scrolls out, don't you, for Kol Nidre. And now you're staring into an empty ark. You no longer have then holy, because the holy things have been taken out. It's now just an ark, an Aron, not Aron Kodesh. But Aron, ark, also means casket. It is as if, symbolically, Yom Kippur Eve, you're staring into the casket of where you might die. This is the day of your death. And you can get through it only because you know how it ends later. It's all play acting. It's drama. And the final scene takes place at the end of today, at Ne'ilah, the closing of the gates. If you stay for Ne'ilah, I hope you will. You will see the ark open, but the Torah scrolls are back in it. Traditionally, when they had an ark with wooden covers, they would open the ark for the whole service. So people could just look at it and see the Torah scrolls back there. And people would take their talit off because now they're not going to be buried anymore. They passed through the day successfully. And they can imagine what it's like to be reborn now. They didn't die. What can life still be for us? That's the message at the end in the Ne'ilah, the closing of the gates. We have two confessions, Remember the short one? Asham knew, Bagad knew. And then there's a long one, for the sin which we have sinned against you, all hate, and so forth. Always when you have the short one, you have the long one next. You do it several times today. When you get to Ne'ilah, that final service, you will get to Ashamnu, that one small confession. You'll turn the page, and you'll discover there's no long confession. It's like, by that time we confessed enough, God. This is fine. And you will then come to a prayer that is often passed over, but it's very important. The next line on the next page, instead of the long confession, says, you reach out your hand to us, O God. You reach out your hand to sinners, certainly to us. That is to be the final message of Yom Kippur. You've practiced your death. Imagine what it would be like. You've given thought all day to what you should do before you die. You want to be reborn. You want new life again. And now you discover you can have it. It is as if you are not alone anymore. An invisible hand, as it were, reaches out through history, through time and space, through your life to pull you forward. That's the final image of Yom Kippur. This invisible hand of God that says, whatever your troubles, you can overcome them. You can lead a new chapter in your life. And so you're ready for the day to end. And what's the final sound at the end of the day? Another Tekiah Gedolah, rebirth. This is a holiday for rebirth, friends. It's a holiday where you have birth and 10 days to think about your life, now to look at your death and say, but wait, I will get more life. How we get through all our prayers is to see such artistry in them, to suspend our disbelief and to see what they have to say to us on an artistic level. As we now stand here on Yom Kippur, the most sacred day of our holiday, of our year, you're urged to think of your life, to lose yourself in the service today, to find one line here and one line there. That's all you need, one line that speaks to you. And you say, that's me today. That's what I want. That's who I am. And to carry that one line, the way you hum a melody from a great song, or you remember one line from a play that you were part of. You're part of the great drama today of the Jewish people, after all. And carry that line with you. And finally, wait for the end, when an invisible hand reaches out to you, and I guarantee you will feel that whatever your state of mind, you can move forward and be reborn. I wish you a year of rebirth, a year of sweetness and goodness, a year when your fondest dreams can maybe even come true. Thank you.
So now you got a sense of what it was like sitting in Dr. Hoffman's classroom at the Hebrew Union College. All the beautiful images, which I wish everyone had the opportunity to understand as Dr. Hoffman explained them to us, are present for us in the hours to come. The sacred story of our people, the faith of the martyrs, the short confession, ten yad, God reaching out his hand, and then that final blast of the shofar, our rebirth for the year ahead. We'll reconvene in the sanctuary at 2 o'clock for Avodah, and then following that, our afternoon service with Torah and Haftarah, the story of Jonah, Yizkor, and our moving the Elah service, the closing of the gates. We look forward to being with you just a few moments. Gemar Tov.
Thank you. Great.